Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am Nury Turkel, a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. I am honored to be joined by my good friend, a well-known scholar, political scientist, Dr. Anders Corr. Anders is an expert on international politics and is the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk. His expertise includes global macro quantitative analysis and public opinion. His recent book, The Concentration of Power, examines the tension between democracy and autocracy. The rise of communist China and its path towards hegemony exemplify historical pattern he carefully examines. His apt observation on China's ambition and global trends have often informed policymakers and activists globally. His perspective on the Uyghur genocide in particular and what is necessary to stop it is fascinating. Thank you, Anders, for coming to speak with us to discuss China and how the international community should respond to Beijing's repression at home and aggression abroad. Also look forward to hearing from you on why it took so long for the international community to wake up to the threat posed by CCP, as well as continuing global implications. I want to start by asking you to analyze the recent events and topics that you touched upon in your book, The Concentration of Power. Is Chinese hegemony inevitable? And if so, why should we worry about it?
I don't think it's inevitable, but it is definitely a there's a high possibility, if you look at historical trends, that China or some other illiberal power like China could rise over time to become a global hegemon in an illiberal way. That's the general trend of history. If you look back, you have tribes, you have kingdoms that develop into kingdoms, kingdoms develop into states, states develop into empires and huge alliance systems like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And over time, these alliance systems are now getting into conflict. And if Beijing wins the current conflict, I think we would see, you would actually get PRC hegemony globally at that point.
Why should the ordinary people worry about China ruling the world? How would that affect ordinary people's lives around the world, particularly in liberal democracies?
Well, imagine a world where Beijing was telling Washington, D.C. what to do. Mm-hmm. Imagine Xi Jinping calling up Biden and ordering him around, right, as if the U.S. is a vassal state. That's what hegemony would look like. Right. And you might expect the kinds of human rights abuses that are currently going on in China to actually happen in the United States at that point.
Are we seeing any of it already becoming part of our lives?
I think that you do have the PRC attempting to influence Washington through our own elites, our business elites, our academic elites, and universities are actually businesses. Right. They've got millions of Chinese students from the PRC, Chinese nationals from the PRC coming in, and all of that is huge money for the universities that they depend on.
Why would, knowing all of this, I mean, it's not that difficult based on your explanation in plain English, why would people not doing enough to push back?
I think people just haven't been educated. I mean, on the realities of China, the media, academia is kind of looking the other way. And the reason, I think, is because mainstream media, mainstream academia lives in a kind of an ecosystem that is with business, big business, mm-hmm, that is doing business in China. And the story is that China is going to get better if we do more business with them. And that feeds into the profits of the big American businesses that are trading with China. I mean, there's over $600 billion of trade last year with China and the US. And we've got, over $2 trillion worth of investments in China, mm-hmm, from our big institutional investors and our state pension funds. And every dollar of that has a special interest behind it that is pushing the narrative that engagement will work. Even though it's obvious now, I think, to most experts, that engagement failed. There's still this inertia going on.
The Congress, as you were, passed an important piece of legislation to address some of the issues involved in U.S.-China relations. Do you think that will force the business community to internally improve their governance, business practices, maybe relocating to countries that does not commit a genocide? Do you see any hope that this important legal tool may help us to see a little bit of different landscape in the business community?
I would hope so. I mean, I think it might improve things a little bit. You know more than I do on this. You're the expert on that. I would turn that question around to you. But I'm cautious because I know these things have loopholes. And
recently, the international community has been a little bit more vocal. The countries joining the boycott, diplomatic boycott, is growing. And recently, French Parliament recognized the atrocities in the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan, as genocide. It's not enough. And what type of additional actions that the international community should take to counter China's growing influence operations around the world?
I would say economic sanctions are the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. We need to massively increase economic sanctions. Currently, we have kept our, the last administration's tariffs are still in place, which is good. I think Europe needs to step up and put in tariffs as well to protect their own economy from China. And I think Europe really should be expected to increase sanctions to the level that we already have on China. So we need a more coordinated effort from our allies, because otherwise we're going to do all the heavy lifting in terms of sanctions and tariffs, and China is just going to divert its trade and its investment portfolios to Europe. Right. To Japan and South Korea. So we have to insist that our allies take part and be responsible democracies in the international system.
You spend a lot of time in Europe. What is your sense on the economic relationship that Europe has with China? What might be the possible reason that the Europeans are not really seeing the way that United States starts seeing the problems in its relationship, economic trade relationship with the PRC?
Europe is still disunited. They have the European Union, and they are trying, I think, some of them to cohere the European Union, given the threats that they face from Russia and China. But still, it's very incoherent. And a country like Germany, for example, has a lot of business in China. And they see their business in China as a drop in the bucket in a way relative to global business with China. And so they look to the US in a sense, I think, to do that heavy lifting. But that heavy lifting, what we can do is not enough. So that's where we have to think of ways to up the game and maybe potentially impose penalties on allies that are not at our level in terms of defense spending, and the last administration actually talked about this, but increase our penalties on allies that are not, up to snuff on defense spending, at least 2% of GDP, and are not up to snuff on tariffs and sanctions against the PRC.
It's perplexing that given Europe's history with fascism, Nazi Germany, and communism, it appears that the Eastern European countries, Eastern Central European countries such as Czech Republic, sees this danger much more clearly than the countries in Western Europe that had first-hand experience with fascism and Holocaust, for example. Do you think that this kind of division will eventually disappear in the European way of dealing with this looming threat or actual present threat coming from Beijing, or maybe possibly from Moscow as well?
Well, I would hope that Europe becomes more unified and that the Eastern European countries that do see the threat of communism and do see the threat, because really what communism does is it leads directly into totalitarianism.
Right.
All the way back to Marx, he was talking about a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right.
And they don't, communists or leftists don't like to admit that he was actually talking about a dictatorship. But then you go into Lenin, and Lenin actually imposed the dictatorship. So, I think that whenever you're close to the dictator, you really see the problem in a way, in a very visceral and even an emotional way,
Yeah.
that people who are farther from the problem just don't understand.
Yeah. The U.S. announced a diplomatic boycott, and one would hope, thinking of 1936 Berlin Olympics, that you would hope that countries like Germany, countries like Norway, would join the effort, but we haven't seen that happen. Only Germany's new foreign minister said that she would not go. And now we have this new craziness been reported that the Chinese government has been warning the athletes that they should not be engaging in political speech or criticism. It shows the aggressiveness, and it will be unhelpful for me particularly to say, I told you so. So what kind of safety measures that anyone can assure on athletes who've been preparing for these games? And when you criticize the Chinese, often people say, oh, you're talking the Cold War language. What would be the right type of message to wake up the people? Is this about sports? Is this about those who care about human rights criticizing this genocidal regime? What is it? What is your response to these issues?
I mean, I think clearly from the safety of U.S. territory,
Yeah.
we can say that there's a genocide going on, even a triple genocide going on also against the Falun Gong and
Right.
against Tibetans. But I've seen reports of the PRC destroying Taoist temples
Yeah.
in China. So the anti-religion campaign of China is really remarkable. But I think one of the concerning things about the Olympics is that we also see our own human rights organizations, American human rights organizations on American soil, in a way, sometimes doing the Chinese Communist Party's job for it by telling athletes, hey, don't say anything negative about
Right.
China because
Right.
you will be endangered. It's absolutely true that they will be endangered,
Yeah.
but it's another matter to then go and do that work for them.
Right. It appears, I've been saying this a lot in public, I've written about it. It doesn't appear that people, especially in the policy community, International Olympic Committee, for example, don't seem to get learn the lessons from the history. It appears that IOC has some sort of affinity to dictatorial authoritarian regimes. This has been happening repeatedly. In confronting threat like the one posed by Chinese regime, and different approaches have created interesting dialogue. Some of them centered on the potential to engage with nation that is operating outside of the international rules-based order. You assert that some of the tactics used by the protesters, Hong Kong protesters, for example, may not be the most efficient means to flatten the hierarchies. In an environment in which the domestic and potential for domestic reforms seems non-existent. Could you elaborate on which type of reform might be pursued and how to achieve that objective?
Well, I have the greatest respect for every single Hong Kong protester.
Yeah.
Out there. They instituted a last stand for freedom and democracy on the streets of Hong Kong. And, what they did was really admirable, I think, in terms of also bringing to the world a dramatization of what the police state, the Chinese police state, could look like if it came to your neighborhood.
Right.
So I think they've done an incredible service. to the world, and I support them all the way. What kind of reforms do we need? I mean, I think that in a way, the international community really failed Hong Kong. We should have, that should have been clear. I mean, the international community fails China over and over again, the Chinese people, right? After 1989, we should have known then. We should have imposed all of the sanctions, all of the tariffs, all of everything that we're talking about now that we should do. We should have done that, 30 years ago. It just doesn't stop, and this is the concern: is that if you've got 30 years of failure to stop the CCP, and it just keeps getting stronger, you got to ask. I mean, is this trend just going to continue, or are our elected leaders actually going to do something?
The one common question often comes up in the public discussion, whether or not there's a dissenting voice within China. If not, if we should abandon the idea of Chinese civic society's contribution to domestic reform. Are we overlooking that possibility, or the Xi Jinping regime have managed successfully to silence a potential domestic dissent to the ongoing and increasingly worrisome repression at home against their own people?
I mean, I defer to you on this question again, but you're the China expert, really. But I am personally a bit pessimistic, because if you look at the political science literature, dictatorships, strong dictatorships, rarely break apart. They rarely come down. Strong democracies also are very, very stable. It's the middle. When you're in the middle between democracy and dictatorship, and you sort of have a parliament that sort of works, but you also have a really strong leader, perhaps like Turkey or something, then you have regime change one way or the other. But then once it gets to that democratic or dictatorial position, they're very stable. So I think that China's Xi Jinping is in a very stable position right now. So I don't have much hope, but maybe I would hope, but I'm not banking on it. I think we need to get very, very busy on the assumption that Xi Jinping will stay in power and that his power will continue to grow.
How should the world see him as a leader for the Chinese state? The reason I ask, when you look at his title, there's no such a thing called president. It starts with the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and then the Commander-in-Chief level of position in China's Central Military Commission, and then the Chairman of the Republic. Even that title that the English title that has been used does not even exist. So to me, that things as small as that can be changed. He is not a president of China. There's no such a thing. So there's a terminology, the general way of seeing this individual has been problematic.
Absolutely agree. I mean, in print we could call him General Secretary. In reality, actually my Journal of Political Risk has published an article by Terry Marsh and Teng Biao, which he's a University of Chicago professor. She's an international human rights lawyer, and they argue, I think very convincingly, that the Chinese Communist Party is a terrorist organization according to US law, and they cite the laws and they show the evidence that it fits within a terrorist organization definition. So I think we need to start thinking in those terms and thinking thinking about them as kind of a mafia-like organization. That is using money, influence, any little advantage they can over business people, over politicians, to coerce them essentially into doing the will of the party.
The well-known Tiananmen Square pro-democracy activist has been saying that this is a mafia organization. He even said that in his testimony in U.S. Congress. And several human rights organizations also using, state violence against vulnerable ethnic and religious group when the Chinese promoting and propagating that they don't engaging in these heinous crimes to achieve social stability and national security. So who's committing violence against who is a good question to ask.
Yeah. The other question, I think, is it a fascist organization, right? Is it a, if you look at pictures of what Hitler was doing or Stalin, which are sort of the prototypical fascists, Mussolini, I think that, actually Beijing right now is even worse.
In your book, you stated that by rejecting the terms socialist and communist for application to the USSR and China respectively, Western leftists cherry-pick only on the least offensive outcome of their ideology. This has essentially fed into enormous problem of disbelief and denial regarding the atrocities committed by CCP against their own citizens. How do we begin to address this particular issue?
Some of my leftist friends, who I get into arguments with, would like to call China state capitalism. That's their term for it, and that fits with their, anti-capitalist stance. And I argue against that because, if you look at really the structure of China, it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping, the party, controls everything. Even if you have things that look capitalist in terms of private business, supposedly private businesses, let's not even go to state-owned, the massive state-owned sector. But even a supposedly private business will have a party, it's required by law to have a party representative on the board that is essentially controlling that board, because the board knows if we don't have the party representatives vote, we're doing something wrong, and we could go to prison.
Right. The recent events that you and I have been following involving this Canadian venture capitalist and corner of the NBA team, the Warrior, making comments about, who cares? It's a kind of emblematic problem that we have across the board. He made clear that he does not only care about the class of people in another country, but if he said he did, which will be lying. These remarks are anomaly. Do they represent the true viewpoint of the majority of the business executives? Most of these people happen to be in the far left of the political spectrum. What is your thoughts on this?
I think that, if you look at the biggest businesses that are doing American businesses in China right now, whether it's Apple, Nike, or any of the rest, they're not stupid. They know the history. They know what happened in 1989. Yeah. They know what's happening to the Uyghurs. They know what's happening to everyone else, any human rights defenders in China. I don't think they care. They want to make money. That's their priority.
So he's being honest.
I think he's being honest. I mean, that's
his, brutal honesty.
It's brutal honesty. Yeah.
So is there any hope for that to be changed at some point? It's depressing to hear that it's a common problem in a business community.
If it doesn't change, then we're going to end up like China. So I would hope that it changes soon.
So I'm laughing, but it's
laughing through the tears.
Right. If somebody says or tells me several years ago that when somebody's asked about their views or his view, her view about a genocide, and a person doing pretty well in a free society with an immigrant refugee background will condone that, I might think that person might have some health issues. But this is the reality that we're living in. It's quite depressing to say the least. So I have one more question about the people on the left, far left. As you're aware that there are close to 40, I think over 40 organizations, including Code Pink, reportedly wrote to President Biden asking him to tone it down so that the desired climate cooperation with the communist China will be realized. And now we're reading more about their fishy background, financial dealings. How do we deal with this kind of domestic problems that plays whataboutism card, that has this appear to be a special place in their mind and soul for socialist communist China. And what do we do about these people who are comfortable criticizing our own country, government, where they are not willing to do the same when they know that there's something is wrong with the people that they're trying to defend?
What's amusing is that this Code Pink argument, right, which is a far left argument now, used to be mainstream just a couple of years ago. The course correction, call by a bunch of mainstream Democrats were saying, hey, we need more cooperation. We need, there are all these things we need cooperation on: the environment, COVID, et cetera, et cetera. Well, these guys aren't cooperating. Actually, what they're trying to do is any engagement, any bargaining with them is an attempt to get relative advantage over the United States. And I mean, Code Pink, a new excellent investigation by New Lines magazine. And this is coming from someone who normally does investigations of the radical right. So it's an investigation of the left by the left, criticizing the money that they believe is coming from China through Goldman Sachs, millions of dollars, and funding some of our most left-wing Marxist organizations.
So this sounds like these 40 organizations that included Code Pink and some environmental groups have their mind elsewhere. They attempt to ignore some of the social injustice issues that they scream from the rooftop in the homeland, and also promote this idea that we can try to save the climate while ignoring the real human suffering. And how would that be possible, right? That you can have the world, the earth, without people. I think it's good strategy, a good way forward to fight genocide and ecocide at the same time. This leads to another question on corruption in the business and political and even academia. Some think tanks and academic institutions, policy experts, have not even publicly sharing their thoughts, real thoughts. And some think tanks still try to water down, try to normalize the regime in Beijing. What do we do about these about the situation?
I think that's a really good point. At this point, when you have genocide going on, silence is complicity. So if you're a professor of Chinese politics, or if you're a think tank expert who specializes in China, and you aren't saying the word genocide, you have to look deep in yourself and say, oh, why am I not speaking the truth?
You and I are a member of some groups and participate in some discussion. You hear very little. Sometimes just irrelevant discussion, taking the conversation to a different place. And I don't understand why it is difficult to see the real problem. That is ignoring of which almost makes you an un-American. So I would say the same thing if I didn't have the connection to the people who've been subject to the genocidal campaign. Elisha Wiesel, son of the famous Holocaust survivor and author the book Elie Wiesel, was interviewed by Josh Rogin of the Washington Post regarding the Beijing Olympics. He stated that he hoped sponsoring corporations and broadcasters, and specifically people of conscience who work there, will do whatever they can to back away from credibility they bestowed on the Chinese regime. What might this look like? Sorry for being back and forth, but this is such a current event.
No, it's absolutely right. People just have to be honest, right? I mean, it's just say the truth. Don't shy away from reality. Don't shy away from being descriptive. I think what's happening is that these experts, these professors, are scared of losing their job, actually. Because if they say something if they say, oh, there's a genocide going on in China, if the tenure system isn't protecting them, which it's supposed to, but in many places it doesn't. If the tenure system doesn't fully protect them, the consul general of the local consulate from, China can call up the president of their university and say, this guy said this, he should be fired, you should get rid of him. We see this in Australia. We saw, the student, even at the undergraduate level, we have the student, Drew Pavlou, who was kicked out of school because of his human rights activism on China. So there is a real risk.
I know Drew quite well, and I met with him. What a courageous young man. He has gone through a lot for just speaking out for Hong Kong and Uyghur people. Let's talk about the perception of China in the Western societies. I listened to one of your recent radio interviews. You brought up something very interesting, which is instead of us changing them, they're changing us. Can you elaborate on that?
The first person that I saw talk about this concept was a professor in Singapore in the late 1940s. And he basically said, when the Chinese Communist Revolution happened in 1949, he saw the excitement among the Chinese people in Singapore, a large segment of them, for the revolution. And he realized that Britain at the time and the US was trying to still maintain business with China. And China was able to use the business links and shifting of the big business links and preferences for socialist and communist business people as opposed to the old school, old China hands in China. But his argument was exactly this, that the more you engage with the Chinese Communist Party, because of their power and the concentration of that power, American power is split up among our corporations, among our politicians. Our politicians only stay in power for 4 years or 8 years and then they go. It's not the case in China.
Right.
So the concentration of power there has a gravitational pull on smaller actors. And America, by design, is a collection of smaller actors. We like it that way. We believe in that. It's our system.
It's a healthy way too.
Right? But it's easy for China to infiltrate and to pick off those actors and to start getting those actors in some kind of an orbital relationship to the CCP. So this is the danger that I think we're really seeing today.
So is that why they're focusing on specific pockets of that power? Like in a state level, in the research community, the high-tech community, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example. Is that why they do that?
I think so. They're really taking a very sophisticated and broad approach, all the way from, as you say, the state level, the city level in L.A. Eric Garcetti in L.A. He's connected through Asia Society to some pretty questionable actors in China.
Is it your observation that many policy makers may be viewing U.S.-China relations as having a non-existent potential to have a balanced coexistence in the international political space as hegemonic superpowers?
Yeah, I mean, if you have two totally different systems and two completely different views of what human rights should be, what democracy is, I mean, there is and if China had been happy just ruling China, if the CCP had been happy just ruling China, I think we wouldn't be in the problem that we are today. But since the 70s, since earlier than the 70s, they were promoting revolution all over the world. Maoist, revolutions in Philippines and Malaya, and it just hasn't stopped. In the 70s, early 70s, they grabbed the Paracel Islands from Vietnam. So they're not even truly just communists. They're just power hungry because they were going against Vietnam, which is a poorer country per capita than China. Yet they were stealing Vietnam's fishing resources. And then they went to the Philippines and started grabbing islands in the Philippine EEZ. And it just, in 1988, in 1995, and 3 islands in 2012. Now Scarborough Shoal is the most recent one. But these guys are power hungry. They're territorially aggressive. And when you see that and recognize that, you just have to say, and you see that it's not ending, You know, you have to say, okay, at some point I stand up and defend myself and defend my allies and insist that our allies actually defend themselves and help defend us. Unless we do that, we're eventually going to be nickel and dime to death.
Do you believe that the United States should be taking strategic measures to use countries like India, for example, to counter China's hegemony?
I think that we should insist that India play its part.
Yeah.
India is traditionally a non-aligned country. They have a strong belief in this.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to get them into a proper alliance. But you know, India's engagement, India now is, you can really see, India's doing missile development with Russia and then selling those missiles to the Philippines, supposedly to defend the Philippines, you know, from China. But could Russia design a kill switch into that missile, for example, so that if Beijing calls up Moscow and says, okay, turn off the missiles that you sold through India to Philippines, you can't trust Russia, you can't trust China, so don't do business with them. India should be sticking to its democratic allies, people who actually believe in its values.
So you think it's the right approach, starting from President Bush 43 onward, to build stronger relationship ties with India?
Absolutely. We absolutely need a strong relationship with India. But we also need to insist that it does its part. And I don't think it's fully doing its part on the democratic alliance system.
The recent events, or the events unfolding in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, has some China aspect to it. I was listening to a German scholar, policy expert, expressing concern about China's potential role. How do the present events in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, for example, play into the potential to tip the scales one way or the other in terms of China's China's impact and continued global influence operations?
Ukraine, I think, is a huge help right now to China in terms of the situation in Ukraine, of Russia threatening an invasion against Ukraine, really starts to distract American public opinion away from the bigger threat, which is China. China has 10 times the GDP of Russia. You know, yes, Russia's a threat, but Russia is a threat more as an alliance, a junior alliance partner to China, than as a threat in and of itself. I think that what Russia is doing is probably in coordination with Beijing. I think Iran and North Korea, all in coordination with Beijing. Beijing, you know, controls imports and exports, those huge amounts of imports and exports, those countries that are absolutely critical for their foreign exchange reserves.
How would you assess the U.S. policies? I'm saying policy because I want you to hear from your assessment on both Trump administration and Biden administration's approach. Are we on the right track? Are we doing enough?
Well, the Trump administration actually completely changed the conversation on China in a very good way, really pointed to the threat. And Americans got it, I think. COVID also really, you know, helped Americans start to look at the details of how the CCP elides and covers up its problems in Wuhan, and its approach to fixing those problems, like total lockdown. You know, so Trump did tremendous work on China, and you know, the problem is, as when the Biden administration comes in, you could already tell before the election that Biden was not serious about China because he was dismissing it as a threat. Then he got that, oh, actually Americans really do believe it's a threat, and you can't fake us around with that anymore, right? So he changed his tune, and his tune is still changed. So he still comes in, and if you read some of his executive orders, the first half of it is very tough on China, and then he deletes the old executive order of Trump, which was a very tough thing on, for example, technology investment, and then he comes in with a new language that weakens the old Trump order. So not only is Biden not really moving the ball forward on China, he's actually letting us recede into even greater weakness.
when you listen to the administration officials, the Biden administration officials, whether they speak in at the public forums or giving media interviews, one of the common questions that they often face is, why do you continue the policy, particularly with respect to China? To me, that's not a fair question. If it's a helpful policy, if it's a bipartisan consensus, based on bipartisan consensus, it should be continued. And I don't quite understand what seems to be the problem for continuancy of a good policy.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration is in a tough position because going backwards in terms of becoming weaker on China is going to be trashed, in the next election. Sticking with the Trump administration policies looks like you don't have your own opinion, right? And getting tougher on China is not an option for Biden and the Democrats, apparently, because they want to save their money for social services and they want to comply with what big business wants, which is more engagement with China, more business with China. So they're in an impossible political position, and I think it provides a real opportunity for, in the next elections, to get someone in office that is much tougher on China, which is what we need.
Yeah, when I listen to the critiques of both administration, it's all about criticism, and you don't hear really good suggestions, strategic policy options being shared. What do you think have been the most significant missteps and miscalculation by the Chinese leaders in responding to the U.S.-led policy responses and a number of issues, Hong Kong and the Uyghur genocide? I brought this up because there's a mismatching understanding. Like one hand they said, oh, we're going too hard on them. One hand it says, oh, we have not done enough. And where it should be, how this should be handled, and how much we should worry about what the Chinese regime will think of our policies in here. I'll let you talk after this, but one of the well-known China experts in Washington told media when Trump announced the entity list designation that this will create negative public opinion in Beijing. So is that something that we should worry about? Should we formulate our policies based on Beijing's potential response, or should we formulate policies based on the lessons learned?
I think Beijing can control sentiment in China, and as long as it's a totalitarian government, in a way, sentiment doesn't matter. It doesn't to what it does, public sentiment. Public sentiment matters a lot in the United States, and this is where
that's how democracy works.
Yeah, it's a democracy, right? And this is where you have massive mistakes coming out of Beijing in terms of, as you say, Hong Kong, the Uyghur genocide. I mean, these are all own goals by Beijing that they just, it's so stupid on their part to, take populations through Hong Kong. That's where all of our American investment was going. Hong Kong had different, we had different export control rules for Hong Kong. So if China wanted export controlled technology, it just had to import it through Hong Kong.
Do you speak of missteps and miscalculation? I think we should also take some responsibility. It should not take the upending of Hong Kong democracy, daily threat against Taiwan, COVID, and Uyghur genocide for the international community to wake up. To me, the problem is that these kind of conversations should be part of the main talking points in the previous or ongoing dialogue with the Chinese. Do you think that human rights should be on top of the agenda? To me, if you don't properly handle the human rights issues, concerns, that's not only not in line with the American values, that also creates a long-term national security crisis, as we're dealing with one today.
Absolutely. For decades, American ambassadors in China have been promoting trade. And human rights is just a footnote. They say, oh yeah, we talked about human rights, but really the meat of the discussions is how do we increase trade for our companies, and what do you want in return, right?
Is the main human rights concern today in U.S.-China relations the Uyghur genocide? Do you think that this should be elevated to the national security level in light of the fact that it involves U.S. legal treaty obligation, call it out, stop, and hold them to account, to now everything we touched in our marketplace possibly being, or if it's imported, possibly being made by Uyghur slaves. And if you talk about Green Revolution, now we know that the batteries, the solar panels are made by enslaved Uyghurs. And it's our multilateral, bilateral relationship has a lot of the Uyghur genocide aspect. So do you think this issue should be elevated to a national security level?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's going to get us other benefits.
Yeah.
We need to decouple from China gradually. Our medicines are all sourced from China.
Yeah.
Our technology is all sourced from China. We had, some of our jet planes have our jet fighters have parts that come from China. Yeah. It's just horrible when you think that China...
Even PPEs that people wear to protect their life.
PPE, we were completely
and made by
at a
Uyghur
loss.
slaves.
Yeah. So yes, elevating it does two goods. One, it gets us back on track in terms of our values in support of human rights and democracy. And two, it helps us start to disengage from China economically, which is what we need to do. It might even help jobs because, we need factories in the United States. Those are jobs. Those are good paying industrial jobs that we can start doing again, and it strengthens our economy, it strengthens our national security.
The business lobbyists quite irresponsibly told Congress when they're fighting against the Forced Labor Prevention Act, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that it's going to take the United States to catch up with China on solar panel, and it requires about 10 years, which is not true. United States made vaccine in 10 months, and it will not require 10 years to catch up. And that kind of rhetoric is really, really unhelpful. It confuses people. Speaking of which, I have a rather interesting question for you. Do you think that PRC, or China's Communist Party, lost its legitimacy because of what they have done, what it has done in Hong Kong, and what it's been doing to the Uyghur people, Tibetans, and others?
I think it's losing its legitimacy. I think, unfortunately, it should have fully lost its legitimacy in 1989. Mm-hmm. Everything after that is more problems, and it's absolutely it is an illegitimate party, it's an illegitimate government, but will average Americans realize that? Will our politicians, will our elites realize that? I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an interesting, insightful conversation. I've learned so much from you. Thank you for coming to Hudson Institute. We would love to welcome you back to have a more of this conversation, because this is not going to go anywhere. We will be benefiting from your knowledge and unique expertise on these issues. Thank you, Anders.
Thank you, Nury.
Thank you.